the shadowed vaults of Mississippi's probate records, a forbidden testament whispers of betrayal and buried sins. Listen closely, for in the misted pines of a dying plantation, one man's dying confession tore open the veil of Southern hypocrisy forever. There lies a document so controversial that it remained sealed for 83 years. The last will and testament of Colonel Silas Beauregard, dated March 1857, distributed his entire estate, valued at what would be millions today, to a single beneficiary. Not his wife of 26 years, not his 3 legitimate children, not his brother who'd fought beside him in the Mexican War. The sole heir to Beauregard's 1,400 acres, his Natchez townhouse, his cotton factoring business, and his considerable investments, was a woman whose name appeared in his ledgers under a very different category of property. The reading of that will spark a legal battle that would consume 3 law firms, divide Natchez society, and expose secrets that powerful families spent decades trying to bury. Before we continue with the story of Silas Beauregard and the inheritance that shouldn't have existed, make sure you're subscribed to Forgotten Liturgy. Hit that notification bell because stories like this one don't appear in history books. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from right now? We love knowing where our audience discovers these dark corners of American history. What makes the Beauregard case so disturbing isn't just what the will revealed, but what it forced into the open about the hidden structures that existed beneath Southern gentility. Natchez in the 1850s represented everything the antebellum South wanted the world to see. White columned mansions lined the riverfront, their piazzas catching the river breeze, mist rising like ghosts from the waters. On Sunday mornings, church bells from St. Augustine and St. Joseph's called the faithful to worship. In the afternoons, carriages rolled down Main Street carrying ladies in silk dresses and gentlemen in fine broadcloth. The city's wealth came from rice, from indigo, from Sea Island cotton, products of the plantations that sprawled across the low country like kingdoms unto themselves. Silas Beauregard's plantation, Whispering Oaks, sat 30 miles inland along the Pearl River. The main house, built in 1789 by his grandfather, rose 3 stories in the Georgian style, symmetrical, imposing design to declare permanence. Live oaks older than the nation itself formed an alley from the river road to the front portico, draped in moss that swayed like funeral veils. Behind the house stretched the working buildings, the kitchen house, the carriage house, the overseer's cottage, and further back, beyond a stand of pines, the quarters where nearly 200 people lived under conditions the law recognized as property ownership. Beauregard himself cut an impressive figure in Natchez society. 47 years old in 1857, he stood over 6 feet tall with the bearing of a military man, which he'd been during the Mexican War. He'd returned with a commendation and a bullet, still lodged near his spine, that gave him a slight limp in damp weather. He served on the vestry of St. Joseph's. He belonged to the Mississippi Society, the Celtic Society, and the Planters Society. His opinions on cotton futures carried weight on Commerce Street. When he spoke at public meetings about states' rights and Southern sovereignty, people listened. His wife, Ada Voss Beauregard, came from the Delacroix family, old Natchez aristocracy, with connections that mattered. She'd brought a substantial dowry to the marriage in 1831, 30 enslaved people, $10,000 in railroad stock, and the kind of family name that opened doors. She bore Silas 3 children who survived infancy: Eliza, born in 1832, Silas Jr., born in 1835, and Magnolia, called Maggie, born in 1838. By all appearances, they represented the ideal Southern family, prosperous, respectable, devout. But appearances in Natchez society were carefully constructed performances, and the Beauregard household maintained its performance with particular rigidity. The household staff at both the plantation and the Natchez townhouse operated under the direction of a woman named Eveline Hargrove. She was 28 years old in 1857, unusually light-skinned and literate, a dangerous combination of attributes that would have raised immediate questions in any other household. Beauregard's ledgers listed her purchase in 1843 from a New Orleans estate sale for the extraordinary sum of $2,500, triple the typical price with no explanation for the premium. Eveline held no official title, yet she controlled access to Beauregard, managed his correspondence, and occupied a small room in the main house at Whispering Oaks rather than in the quarters. She dressed in plain but quality fabrics. She wore a gold locket that no one had ever seen her without. She spoke with the diction of someone educated beyond her supposed station, and she moved through the Beauregard house with an authority that made visitors uncomfortable, and made Ada Beauregard's lips thin with barely suppressed rage. Plantation society had its unspoken rules about these arrangements. Men of means often maintained relationships that existed in the shadows, producing children whose parentage everyone knew, but no one acknowledged, as long as certain proprieties were observed, as long as the legal wife maintained her position, as long as the children of these unions remained enslaved, as long as the whole structure stayed buried beneath Gentile denial, society could function. Silas Beauregard had violated every single one of those rules, though no one yet understood how completely. The spring of 1857 brought an unusual drought to the Low Country. The rice fields that should have been flooded stood cracked and dry, dust rising in the heat like whispered sins. Cotton prices had begun their slow decline that would accelerate into the Panic of '57 by August. In Natchez' drawing rooms, conversation turned more frequently to Northern aggression, to the Dred Scott decision handed down that March, to whether the Union could survive. The air felt heavy with more than humidity. It carried the weight of a world beginning to crack at its foundations. At Whispering Oaks, the tension took a more personal form. Ada Beauregard had returned to Natchez in February, taking young Maggie with her, and had not come back to the plantation. Eliza, now 25 and unmarried, a source of growing concern, remained in the city as well. Only Silas Jr., training in his father's cotton factoring business, made occasional visits to Whispering Oaks, and even he found reasons to keep them brief. The household at Whispering Oaks then consisted primarily of Silas, Eveline, the field workers, and the immediate house staff. It was during this period of relative isolation that Silas Beauregard began to make arrangements that would shatter everything his family assumed about their future. On the evening of March 14, 1857, Silas Beauregard sent word to Natchez requesting the presence of his attorney, Abram Claiborne, at Whispering Oaks. The message, delivered by a trusted courier, specified that Claiborne should come alone and should bring the necessary materials for drafting a complex testamentary document. Claiborne, who had served the Beauregard family for 15 years, found the request unusual but not alarming. Wealthy men often updated their wills. What he did not expect was the scene he encountered in Beauregard's study 2 days later, in the dim lamplight flickering against oak panels. Claiborne would later testify in court that he arrived at Whispering Oaks on the afternoon of March 16th to find Beauregard in obvious physical distress. The colonel sat behind his mahogany desk, his face drawn and gray, one hand pressed against his lower back. A decanter of whiskey sat at his elbow, unusual for a man who typically drank with moderation. Most striking was Eveline's presence in the room, not serving, not waiting for instructions, but seated in the leather chair normally reserved for business associates, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. "Sir, I should perhaps call for Dr. Malcolm Thorne," Claiborne said, noting the sheen of sweat on Beauregard's forehead despite the cool March weather. "No doctors." Beauregard's voice came rough but firm. "I know exactly what's wrong with me, Abram, and no physician can cure it. I need you to write a will tonight, and I need it done exactly as I dictate, no matter what your professional judgment might counsel." Claiborne glanced at Eveline, whose presence made the situation deeply irregular. "Colonel, these matters are typically, I need witnesses who can read and write and who will testify to my soundness of mind." Beauregard interrupted. "Eveline is one of the most intelligent people I know. She'll witness. You'll find 2 others among my people who can sign their names. I've already arranged it." The attorney's discomfort was palpable, but Beauregard was a client of significant standing. Claiborne opened his case and prepared his materials. What followed was a dictation that would take nearly 3 hours, interrupted frequently by Beauregard's pauses to master what was clearly considerable pain. The will began conventionally enough with the standard declarations of soundness of mind and body, though the latter was clearly generous, and the revocation of all previous testaments. Then came the provisions that would change everything. "I give and bequeath to Eveline Hargrove," Beauregard dictated, his words precise despite his physical suffering. "Currently held as property at Whispering Oaks Plantation, her immediate and unconditional freedom upon my death, along with all documents necessary to establish her status as a free woman of color under the laws of Mississippi and the United States." Claiborne's pen hesitated. Manumission clauses were not uncommon in wills, though they were becoming increasingly restricted by state law. But Beauregard was just beginning. "I further give and bequeath to the aforementioned Eveline Hargrove, now to be known as Eveline Hargrove Beauregard, the entirety of Whispering Oaks Plantation, including all lands, buildings, equipment, livestock, and all persons currently held in bondage thereon. I further bequeath to her my townhouse at number 14 Cypress Street in Natchez, along with all furnishings and household goods therein." The scratching of the pen stopped entirely. "Colonel, I must strongly advise," wrote Abram. Beauregard's voice carried an edge that silenced objection. "I further bequeath to Eveline Hargrove Beauregard all shares and interests in the firm of Beauregard and Voss Cotton Factors, all railroad stock, all bank deposits, all bonds and securities, and all personal property of every kind and description. I appoint her sole executor of this my last will and testament with full power to act without bond or judicial oversight." The room had grown very quiet except for the sounds of Claiborne's pen and the distant evening songs from the quarters, like faint hymns fading into thunder. Eveline sat perfectly still, her face revealing nothing. "Regarding my wife, Ada Voss Beauregard," Silas continued, each word seeming to cost him, "I hereby grant her the legal minimum dower right required under Mississippi law, 1/3 of my real property for her natural life. However, said dower, right shall be subject to Eveline Hargrove Beauregard's primary ownership and management, and Ada Voss Beauregard shall have no voice in the administration of any property whatsoever." Claiborne had stopped even pretending to write. "Colonel, your wife has legal protections. Your children have expectations. This will not stand in court. Beyond the legal impossibilities, a woman of color cannot own. Write it all down, Abram, exactly as I say it. There are ways around the legal restrictions and you know it. Property can be held in trust. Arrangements can be made. I've studied the law. I'm not the first man to try to provide for." He stopped. His breathing labored. "Write that I acknowledge Eveline's son Josiah, born June 12, 1844, as my natural child, and I direct that he be raised as a free man, with all advantages available to him." The silence that followed this statement seemed to thicken the air in the study, like fog creeping from the river. Josiah was 13 years old in 1857, a boy who worked in the Whispering Oak stables, and who bore such a resemblance to Silas Beauregard that only willful blindness could deny the connection. The acknowledgement in writing made explicit what society demanded remain forever unspoken. Furthermore, Silas said, his voice weakening, "I acknowledge Eveline's daughter, Calpurnia, born April 3, 1847, as my natural child, and I direct that she be raised with the same advantages. 2 children, not merely one indiscretion, but an ongoing relationship spanning at least 13 years, producing offspring who shared blood with the legitimate Beauregard heirs, but who had lived their entire lives in legal bondage to their own father." Claiborne found his voice. "Colonel, I cannot in good conscience allow you to proceed without understanding the consequences. Your wife will contest this immediately. Your children will never accept it. Natchez society will." "Natchez society," Silas interrupted with unexpected venom, "built its fortune on systematic rape and called it breeding stock. Every fine house on the riverfront contains children whose fathers own them. Every respectable gentleman conducts business by day and violates the very people he claims as property by night. The only difference, Abram, is that I am telling the truth about it. I am putting in legal writing what every man in Natchez does in the darkness." He leaned forward, and the movement clearly cost him. "I am dying, Abram. Dr. Malcolm Thorne told me 6 months ago that the cancer spreading from my bowels would kill me within the year. I've hidden it from everyone except Eveline. I have perhaps weeks remaining, possibly less, and I cannot leave this earth knowing that my own children will be sold to settle my debts, or that the woman I should have had the courage to marry openly will be returned to bondage when I die." The admission hung in the air like smoke, curling from a dying candle. Claiborne's hands trembled slightly as he resumed writing. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the technical details, the trust arrangements that might survive legal challenge, the specific bequests designed to provide immediate liquid assets, the careful wording that attempted to thread the needle of Mississippi law regarding property rights and manumission. When the document was finally complete, Beauregard insisted on reading it through himself, his finger following each line despite the obvious pain the focus caused him. Then he signed it with a steady hand, the signature no different from the one he'd used on hundreds of business documents. Eveline signed as witness, her handwriting notably educated and precise. 2 other enslaved people from the plantation, a man named Ezra, who served as a blacksmith and had taught himself to read, and a woman named Ruth, who'd learned letters from a former mistress, were brought in to witness as well. Claiborne noted their marks and signatures with evident discomfort. "I'll file this with my other documents," Claiborne said carefully as he prepared to leave. "But, Colonel, I urge you to reconsider. At least provide more substantially for your legitimate children. Make some gesture that might soften their response." "My legitimate children," Silas said, and there was infinite weariness in his voice, "will inherit the protection of their mother's family name, the education I've already paid for, and the social position that comes with white skin in Natchez. Josiah and Calpurnia will inherit nothing but their freedom if I don't act now. The law sees them as things, Abram, things I own, things that could be sold to pay my creditors if I don't make this ironclad." He looked at Eveline then, and something passed between them that Claiborne could not name. "I've lived a coward's life. Let me at least die honestly." Claiborne departed Whispering Oaks that evening with a document he knew would destroy multiple lives, possibly including his own professional reputation. He rode back to Natchez through darkness, pine shadows lengthening like judgments, turning over in his mind whether he had a legal obligation to inform Ada Beauregard of what her husband had done. He decided, perhaps out of cowardice himself, that attorney-client privilege prevented him from speaking. It would be his silence that allowed the situation to unfold as catastrophically as it did. Silas Beauregard lived for another 6 weeks. During that time, he remained at Whispering Oaks, his condition deteriorating rapidly. Eveline nursed him through increasing pain, administering laudanum when it became unbearable, reading to him in the evenings from books they'd apparently shared for years. History, philosophy, poetry. Josiah and Calpurnia were allowed to visit their father openly during his final days, a sight that scandalized the white overseers, but that none of them dared question, given Beauregard's fearsome reputation, even in decline. Ada Beauregard did not visit. Whether she'd heard rumors of her husband's condition and chose to stay away, or whether Silas had deliberately prevented word from reaching her, the historical record does not make clear. But she remained in Natchez, attending social functions, maintaining the fiction that her husband was simply occupied with plantation business during the difficult agricultural season. Silas Beauregard died on the morning of April 28, 1857. Eveline was with him at the end. According to later testimony from the house staff, his last words were, "Tell them the truth, all of it." The truth, when it emerged, would prove more destructive than even he might have anticipated. News of Colonel Beauregard's death reached Natchez the same day. By protocol and custom, Ada received visitors offering condolences at the Cypress Street house. She wore black silk, received guests in the parlor, accepted their expressions of sympathy with appropriate dignity. Everyone remarked on her composure, on the strength she displayed in her time of trial. She had no idea that she'd already lost everything. The reading of the will was scheduled for May 3rd, 5 days after Silas's death, and 1 day after his burial in St. Joseph's churchyard, a burial that Ada had insisted be properly conducted, despite her private fury at her husband's long absence and sudden death. She'd invited only family and close associates to the reading. Her brother, James Delacroix, her children, Silas's brother Thorne, and several family friends who'd served as informal advisors over the years. Abram Claiborne arrived at the Cypress Street house at 10 Gaude in the morning, carrying the will and wearing the expression of a man walking to his own execution. He'd tried twice to meet privately with Ada before this moment to prepare her, but she'd been too occupied with funeral arrangements to see him. Now he would have to deliver the news in public, before witnesses. Ada sat in the largest chair in the drawing room, her children around her. Eliza, at 25, had never married despite her mother's efforts, a source of ongoing tension that had deepened when Silas refused to provide an adequate dowry for the matches Ada had arranged. Silas Jr., 22, worked in his father's cotton factoring business, and assumed he would inherit both the firm and the plantation. Young Maggie, 19, sat with her hands folded, still the beautiful daughter. The room smelled of furniture polish and the flowers that had been arriving steadily since the news of Silas's death. Spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the garden, like a false benediction. Everything appeared civilized, ordered, proper. Claiborne cleared his throat. "Mrs. Beauregard, family members, I must begin by saying that the contents of Colonel Beauregard's last will and testament are highly unusual. I advised against several provisions. But the colonel was adamant, and in my professional judgment of sound mind, when he dictated his wishes. Ada's expression suggested this preamble was unnecessary. My husband was always particular about his affairs. Mr. Claiborne, please proceed with the reading. What followed would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Claiborne read through the opening sections quickly, the standard legal language. The revocation of previous wills. Then he reached the substantive bequests. His voice became strained as he read the words that granted freedom to Eveline, that acknowledged Josiah and Calpurnia as Silas's natural children, that transferred the entirety of the estate to a woman who had been legally property when the will was written. The reaction was not immediate. For several seconds, the room remained silent as the assembled family tried to process what they just heard. Eliza looked confused, as if she'd misheard. Silas Jr. leaned forward, his face reddening. James Delacroix gripped the arms of his chair. Ada Beauregard went absolutely still. Then Silas Jr. exploded. This is absurd. It's forgery. My father would never. He couldn't have. Your father dictated this will to me directly, Claiborne said quietly. I witnessed his signature. The document has been properly executed with multiple witnesses. Witnesses? James Delacroix's voice cut through the chaos. What witnesses? Who would witness such a document? When Claiborne explained that the witnesses included enslaved people who could read and write, including Eveline herself, the room erupted. Multiple people spoke at once. Silas Jr. stood and paced, his hands clenched. Eliza began to cry, but Ada remained seated and silent, her face hardening into an expression that suggested not shock, but confirmation of long-held suspicions. Finally, she raised one hand, and the room quieted. When she spoke, her voice carried the cold precision of sharpened steel. How long? Claiborne blinked. I'm sorry, Mrs. Beauregard. How long was my husband conducting this relationship with his property? The attorney hesitated. The will acknowledges children born in 1844 and 1847. 13 years, Ada said softly. My youngest daughter was born in 1838. For 19 years of our marriage. Then while I bore his children, managed his household, maintained his position in society. He was... She stopped, mastering herself with visible effort. And this woman, this Eveline, she now owns my home. The will provides for your dower right, 1/3 of the real property for your lifetime. Subject to her ownership, under her management, she owns the house I furnished, the plantation I helped build, the business my dowry helped establish. Ada's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrible than shouting would have been. And my children inherit nothing. Claiborne had no answer that would soften the blow. By the provisions of Silas Beauregard's will, his legitimate children received no direct bequests. They had no claim to the plantation, the Natchez properties, the business interests, or even their father's personal effects. Everything had been transferred to Eveline and her children. Silas Jr. found his voice. This is slavery's revenge. My father went mad. He must have some disease of the mind. Your father was in full possession of his faculties, Claiborne said firmly. He understood exactly what he was doing. He stated explicitly that he was correcting an injustice. Injustice? Eliza's voice rose. He's made us beggars. We have nothing. How am I to marry with no portion? How is Silas to establish himself in business? How is mother to live? The dower right provides for us to live as dependents in our own home at the pleasure of a woman who was property. James Delacroix stood now, his voice shaking with rage. This is unconscionable. It's illegal. A woman of color cannot own property in Mississippi beyond the most limited. The property is held in trust with arrangements I believe will withstand legal challenge, Claiborne said. Colonel Beauregard studied the law extensively before drafting these provisions. Ada stood then, and something in her posture made everyone else fall silent. Where is she now? Mrs. Beauregard, where is the woman who has taken my life? Claiborne's reluctance was visible. She remains at Whispering Oaks with the children, as the will specifies, is her right. Her right, Ada tested the words like poison. Send word to her. Tell her that the family wishes to discuss the terms of the will. Tell her we may be prepared to reach an accommodation that would avoid the ugliness of a public contest. Tell her. She paused, and her smile was terrible. Tell her I wish to meet my husband's other family. The message went to Whispering Oaks that afternoon. Eveline's response arrived the next morning. She would come to Natchez, but only with legal representation present. She suggested they meet at Claiborne's office rather than the Cypress Street house, and she insisted that Josiah and Calpurnia would accompany her, as they had as much right to hear the discussion as Silas's legitimate children. The proposed meeting was scheduled for May 8th. In the 5 days between Ada's discovery of the will and that meeting, Natchez society caught fire with scandal. The details leaked, perhaps through household servants, perhaps through deliberate whispers from Ada's allies, perhaps simply because secrets of this magnitude could never be contained. By the end of the first week of May, everyone in Natchez's upper circles knew that Colonel Silas Beauregard had freed his enslaved mistress in his will, had acknowledged their children, and had disinherited his white family to provide for them. The reaction split along predictable lines. Many expressed outrage on Ada's behalf, calling Silas's actions a betrayal of everything civilized society held dear. How could a man of his standing, his reputation, his position, commit such an act? Others, particularly among the younger men, whispered that Silas had only made public what half of Natchez practiced in private. A few, very few, dared to suggest that perhaps there was something admirable in a man trying to provide for children he'd fathered, regardless of their mother's race. But beneath all the public discourse ran a deeper current of fear. If Silas Beauregard, respected, wealthy, connected, could do this, what did it say about the stability of other arrangements? How many other white families might find themselves displaced by the very people they'd kept in bondage? The will represented a fundamental violation of the unspoken rules that allowed Southern society to function. It had to be challenged, had to be defeated, or the implications would spread like cholera through the social order. The meeting on May 8th took place in Abram Claiborne's office on Commerce Street, in a room far too small for the number of people who crowded into it. Rain whispering over the tin roof like forgotten prayers. Ada arrived first with her brother James, her children, and 2 additional attorneys she'd retained, specialists in probate law from prominent Natchez families. They arranged themselves on one side of the long table that dominated the room. When Eveline arrived, the effect on the room was immediate and visceral. She wore a dress of dark gray wool, simple but well-made, with a white collar. Her hair was pulled back severely. She carried herself with remarkable composure for a woman walking into a room full of people who wished her destroyed. Josiah, at 13, wore a suit that had clearly been tailored for him. Not servant's clothes, but the kind of outfit a gentleman's son would wear. Calpurnia, at 10, wore a blue dress with careful stitches, her hair in neat braids. Both children bore the unmistakable Beauregard features, Josiah especially, with Silas's strong jaw and deep-set eyes. The moment when Ada Beauregard and Eveline Hargrove faced each other across that table contained more unspoken history than any document could capture. These 2 women had lived in the same houses for 14 years, one as mistress, one as property. They had both borne Silas Beauregard's children. They had both, in different ways, built their lives around a man who'd kept them in separate worlds that should never have intersected. Now those worlds had collided, and one of them would be destroyed in the wreckage. Ada spoke first, her voice controlled but carrying an edge like ice cracking. You understand, and I presume, that my husband's will cannot stand, that the law protects a wife's rights, that no court in Mississippi will allow this travesty. Eveline met her gaze directly, a deliberate violation of the social codes that governed how a woman of color should address a white woman, especially one of Ada's standing. I understand that your husband chose to acknowledge the truth. Finally, the simple statement landed like a physical blow. Ada's composure cracked slightly, color rising in her cheeks. You seduced him, used your position in his household to manipulate a man who... I was 14 years old when your husband purchased me in New Orleans. Eveline's voice remained level but gained intensity. 14. I didn't seduce anyone, Mrs. Beauregard. I was taught to read and write by my previous mistress, which made me valuable as a household manager. That's what your husband told people. He bought me for the truth about what else I was purchased for, what I had no choice about. I assume you can imagine. The room had gone deathly silent, like the hush before a storm. Silas Jr. half rose from his chair, but James Delacroix gripped his arm, holding him back. You will not speak to my mother that way, Eliza said, her voice shaking. You have no right to. I have every right. Eveline turned to Eliza, and now there was steel in her tone. I have the right your father gave me in his will. I have the right of someone who managed your household, raised your children when they were young, kept your father's books, ran his business affairs when he was away, and bore his children just as your mother did. The only difference is that I did all of it without choice, without legal protection, without the ability to say no. And now your father has tried to give me what he should have given me 13 years ago. my freedom, and the means to protect my children. Ada's attorney, a gray-haired man named Thorne Delacroix, interjected, "Miss Hargrove, your personal history, however unfortunate, is not relevant to the legal questions at hand. Colonel Beauregard's will violates multiple provisions of Mississippi law. Property cannot be transferred in this manner to a woman of color. Children born of an enslaved mother are themselves enslaved and cannot inherit. The dower rights of the legal wife supersede any testamentary provisions to the contrary. This will is legally invalid on multiple grounds." "Then why are we having this meeting?" Eveline asked. "If you're so confident the will is invalid, why not simply proceed to court?" Delacroix and James Delacroix exchanged a glance. The truth was more complicated than Eveline's question suggested, and everyone in the room knew it. The legal landscape regarding property rights and race in 1857 Mississippi was a patchwork of contradictions. While the law severely restricted what free people of color could own or inherit, it also recognized trusts, recognized private arrangements, and critically recognized that white men of property had certain privileges in disposing of their estates. Silas had structured the will carefully, using legal mechanisms designed to survive challenge. More importantly, a public court battle would expose details that neither family wanted examined. James Delacroix cleared his throat. "We are here, Miss Hargrove, because despite the legal invalidity of this document, we recognize that a protracted court case would be unpleasant for all involved. The details of my brother-in-law's private life would become public record. Names would be named. Children would be scrutinized. We are prepared to offer you a settlement that would provide for you and your children's future without the necessity of litigation." "How generous," Eveline said, and the sarcasm was barely veiled. "What are the terms of this settlement?" Ada leaned forward. "You receive your freedom, which the law would likely grant regardless. You receive $20,000, enough to establish yourself and your children comfortably anywhere in the North, where attitudes toward your situation might be more accommodating. In exchange, you renounce any claim to the Beauregard properties, the business interests, and you leave Mississippi within 30 days. The offer was substantial in monetary terms. $20,000 represented significant wealth, but it was a fraction of what the estate was worth, and everyone in the room knew it. More importantly, it required Eveline to abandon the South, to take her children away from the only home they'd known, to accept exile as the price of their freedom. "Your husband left me everything because he knew what would happen to me and my children if he didn't," Eveline said quietly. "He knew that the moment he died, I would become vulnerable, that someone would try to sell me to settle debts, or that your family would try to remove me. He knew that Josiah and Calpurnia, his children, would be treated as property to be disposed of. He spent 6 weeks dying in agony, Mrs. Beauregard, and he used that time to ensure we would be protected. I don't believe he would want me to accept 30 pieces of silver and disappear." "How dare you quote scripture at me?" Ada's voice dropped to a hiss. "You who helped destroy my marriage, who lived in my houses, who bore children to my husband while I—" She stopped, visibly fighting for control. Eliza placed a hand on her mother's arm. "Mother, please." But Ada shook her off. "No, I have been silent for too long, accommodating for too long, playing the gracious lady while my husband's infidelity happened under my own roof." She turned her full attention to Eveline, and the pain beneath the anger was suddenly visible. "Did you love him?" The question hung in the air, transforming the legal negotiation into something more raw and human, like a confession in the dead of night. Eveline's composure finally cracked slightly. "I was 14 when he bought me, Mrs. Beauregard. I learned to survive. Whether that became love or simply the need to protect myself and my children, I don't know if I can answer that question, but I do know that he gave me the only gift he could, the chance to not be property anymore. And I know that if I surrender that now, my children will spend their lives vulnerable to anyone who decides their freedom is inconvenient." Abram Claiborne, who'd remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Perhaps we might focus on the children. Surely both families can agree that the welfare of these young people, all of them, should be paramount." "My children's welfare," Ada said coldly, "is threatened by this will. My son cannot establish himself in business without capital. My daughters cannot make appropriate marriages without portions. This woman's children were born enslaved and should remain so under the law." Josiah, who'd been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. His voice was young but steady. "I am 13 years old. For my entire life, I have been property. I have watched my mother serve people who owned her. I have worked in stables alongside men who could be sold at any moment. I have a 10-year-old sister who knows that her life could be bought and sold. My father, and he was my father. Everyone can see it. Everyone has always known it. My father tried to give us what you take for granted. The right to own ourselves. How is it justice to take that away? The directness of the statement, coming from a child who'd had no voice in any of this, created a moment of uncomfortable silence, like thunder rumbling distant. Silas Jr., looking at Josiah, perhaps seeing for the first time a half-brother rather than property, seemed about to speak, but his mother's glare silenced him. Justice, Ada said, is not served by destroying one family to benefit another. Mr. Delacroix, how do we proceed with the legal challenge? Delacroix outlined the strategy. They would file for probate in the Court of Common Pleas, arguing that the will violated public policy, exceeded the testator's legal authority to dispose of property to persons of color, and infringed upon Ada's dower rights. They would call witnesses to testify to Silas's erratic behavior in his final weeks, suggesting diminished capacity. They would argue that Eveline had exercised undue influence over a dying man. As Delacroix spoke, Eveline's attorney, a man named Ezra Marrow, one of the few Natchez lawyers willing to take such a controversial case, made notes. Marrow was Quaker, opposed to slavery on religious grounds, and willing to weather social ostracism to challenge it legally wherever possible. The Beauregard case gave him precisely that opportunity. The meeting concluded with no agreement. The battle would move to court, and everyone present understood what that meant. Months or years of litigation, astronomical legal costs, and the inevitability that Natchez society would be forced to examine questions it preferred to leave unasked. As they filed out of Claiborne's office, Ada and Eveline passed within inches of each other at the door. Ada paused, turned, and spoke so softly that only Eveline could hear. He called your name when he was dying, didn't he? Not mine. Not his children's. Yours. Eveline met her eyes. Yes. Ada's face crumpled for just an instant before she mastered herself and walked away, her children and attorneys trailing behind her. It was the last time the two women would speak directly to each other. The legal battle that followed would consume Natchez society for the next 18 months, and would expose far more than anyone anticipated. The case of Beauregard versus Beauregard Estate entered the Court of Common Pleas on May 15, 1857. Judge Josiah Hargrove, a distinguished jurist with 30 years on the bench and extensive ties to Natchez's planter class, would preside. His initial ruling on the preliminary motion suggested which way the wind would blow. He granted Ada's attorneys broad latitude in questioning the will's validity, while restricting Marrow's ability to introduce evidence about Silas's reasoning or intent. But the case's timing proved critical in ways no one initially understood. The Panic of 1857 struck that August, triggered by the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company. Banks failed across the country. Credit dried up. Cotton prices, already declining, plummeted. Businesses that seemed solid in May were bankrupt by September. The financial crisis hit Natchez hard, and it hit the Beauregard business interests catastrophically. Silas had been leveraged, not excessively by the standards of the time, but enough that the sudden credit contraction created immediate problems. Beauregard and Voss, the cotton factoring firm, had extended credit to numerous planters against their expected fall crops. When cotton prices collapsed, those planters couldn't pay their debts, which meant Beauregard and Voss couldn't pay its creditors. The firm's lines of credit with Natchez banks were called in. The railroad stock that had seemed like solid assets lost 80% of their value virtually overnight. By October 1857, Whispering Oaks Plantation faced the real possibility of foreclosure. The Natchez townhouse had liens against it. Even Ada's dower rights would be worthless if the properties were sold to satisfy creditors. And under Silas's will, Eveline Hargrove was the legal owner responsible for managing this financial catastrophe. The situation created a bizarre inversion of the normal order. Eveline, still technically enslaved pending resolution of her manumission, effectively controlled assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, while also being responsible for debts that could destroy everything. She had legal authority to make decisions about the estate. But exercising that authority meant navigating a world that fundamentally rejected the idea that someone like her could possess such power. She surprised everyone, working with Ezra Marrow and a small group of Natchez businessmen who saw profit opportunity despite social scruples. Eveline began making ruthless financial decisions. She sold off the railroad stock before it could fall further. She negotiated directly with creditors, offering partial immediate payment in exchange for forgiveness of the remainder, taking advantage of the panic-driven desperation for any cash liquidity. She cut costs at Whispering Oaks dramatically, reducing the household staff and consolidating operations. Most controversially, she sold 40 people from the Whispering Oaks workforce to a Louisiana planter for cash that allowed her to meet immediate debts. The sale prevented foreclosure, but it also revealed the fundamental impossibility of her position. A woman who'd been enslaved herself was now forced to sell others into bondage in order to protect her own freedom and her children's future. The moral complexity was lost on no one, least of all Eveline herself. Thunder rumbling over Cypress waters like divine reproach. Abram Voss, one of the men sold to Louisiana, was 26 years old and had lived his entire life at Whispering Oaks. Years later, in testimony given to Freedmen's Bureau representatives during Reconstruction, he described the day of the sale. Miss Eveline called us all together in the yard. She was crying. She said she was sorry, that she had no choice, that if the bank took the plantation, we'd all be sold anyway, but scattered to whoever would buy. She said she was trying to keep families together as much as she could, that the Louisiana man promised not to separate married folks. She said she knew what it felt like to be sold. Then she looked at me, and I saw that she did know, and I hated her for it, and I pitied her for it, and I didn't know what to feel because the woman selling me had been property just like me 6 months before. The sales provided enough capital to stabilize the estate financially. But they also gave Ada's attorneys powerful ammunition. How could a woman claiming to act out of Silas's moral vision turn around and sell human beings for profit? How could she claim to deserve the estate when her first instinct was to liquidate it? Marrow had an answer, and it was devastating. Mrs. Ada Beauregard and her children have never opposed slavery. They have never questioned the right to buy and sell human beings. Their objection to Miss Hargrove is not that she sold enslaved people to save the estate. It's that she, having been enslaved herself, had the audacity to make that decision. Their argument isn't about morality. It's about who has the right to exercise power. And their position is that power can never rest with someone who looks like Miss Hargrove, no matter what the law or the deceased's intentions might say. The argument forced the case into territory that made everyone uncomfortable. Natchez' elite didn't want to examine the logical contradictions of slavery in open court. They didn't want to discuss why it was acceptable for white men to father children with enslaved women, but unacceptable to acknowledge those children. They didn't want a smart Quaker attorney picking apart the rationalizations that allowed civilized Christians to participate in human bondage. But as the case ground forward through the fall and winter of 1857, that examination became unavoidable. The witness testimony proved particularly explosive. Ada's attorneys called housekeepers and overseers from Whispering Oaks to testify about Eveline's position in the household, trying to establish that she'd exercised undue influence over Silas. What emerged instead was a portrait of a relationship far more complex than either side wanted to acknowledge. Calpurnia Marrow, who'd worked as a cook at Whispering Oaks for 20 years, testified that Colonel Beauregard discussed business matters with Eveline regular. She kept his books. She wrote his letters. When he was away, she made decisions about the plantation. Everyone knew she had authority, even if it wasn't spoke of official. Under cross-examination from Marrow, Calpurnia was asked directly, "Did Colonel Beauregard appear to value Miss Hargrove's judgment?" "Yes, sir, he did." "Did he treat her with respect?" A pause. "More than most men treat their property, sir." "Did he love her?" Ada's attorneys objected strenuously, but Judge Hargrove allowed the question. Calpurnia Marrow looked at Ada Beauregard, then at Eveline, then down at her hands. "I don't know about love, sir, but I know he was different with her than he was with Mrs. Beauregard. Quieter, like he could rest. Mrs. Beauregard always wanted something. Some improvement to the house, some invitation to accept, some social occasion to attend. Eveline just let him be who he was, I suppose." The testimony devastated Ada visibly. The courtroom had been packed for weeks. Scandals like this drew crowds even in winter, and the whispers after Marrow's testimony were audible despite the judge's gavel, like wind through decayed pines. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from Dr. Malcolm Thorne, the physician who treated Silas during his final illness. Thorne had known about the cancer for months and had, at Silas's request, kept silent about the prognosis. Now called to testify about Silas's mental state, he was forced to reveal conversations he'd had with his patient. Colonel Beauregard knew he was dying, Thorne testified. He was fully cognizant of his condition and its progression. He was not delirious. He was not impaired by laudanum when we discussed his affairs. He told me explicitly that he intended to provide for Eveline and their children. Their children? Ada's attorney pounced. He acknowledged paternity directly to you. He did, he said. Thorne paused, visibly uncomfortable. He said that he'd fathered 5 children in his life, 3 with his wife, 2 with Eveline. He said he'd failed all 5 of them in different ways, but that he could at least ensure that Josiah and Calpurnia would be free. Did he express any concern for his legitimate children's welfare? He said they would inherit the protection of their mother's name and the advantages of being white in Natchez. He was quite specific about that phrasing, just when the courtroom thought it couldn't become more uncomfortable. Ada's attorney asked the question that would explode the case entirely. Dr. Thorne, in your professional opinion, was Colonel Beauregard's judgment impaired by his illness or medication? No. Did he seem rational? Completely. Then why, in your medical opinion, would a rational man of his standing commit such an act of social and familial destruction? Thorne looked directly at Ada Beauregard. He told me something else. He said that he'd lived his entire adult life according to rules that required him to lie about who he was and what he wanted. He said Southern society demanded that men like him maintain 2 families, one public, one private, and never acknowledge the truth of either. He said he was tired of lying, that dying focused the mind wonderfully on questions of honesty, and that the greatest crime he'd committed wasn't the relationship with Eveline. It was purchasing her in the first place, owning another human being, and fathering children into bondage. He said if the law wouldn't allow him to correct that crime, then the law was more corrupted than he was. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hargrove had to recess for 15 minutes to restore order. Ada left the courthouse that day, surrounded by supporters, but the damage had been done. Silas's own doctor had testified that the will reflected not diminished capacity, but moral clarity, that the man everyone thought they knew had actually been living a lie that he'd finally decided to expose. The testimony created fractures in Natchez society that went beyond one family's scandal. Men who'd attended church with Silas, who'd done business with him, who'd maintained their own dual families in the shadows, suddenly had to confront the possibility that he'd been right to tell the truth. Women who'd maintained willful ignorance about their husbands' activities were forced to wonder what was happening in their own households. The case stopped being about one will and became about the entire structure of Southern society. And then, in January 1858, something happened that changed everything again. Calpurnia Beauregard, Eveline's 10-year-old daughter, fell ill with scarlet fever. The disease swept through Natchez that winter, killing dozens of children. Eveline, desperate to save her daughter, hired the best physicians available, and had the money to do so because of the estate she controlled. Ada's attorneys attempted to argue that Eveline had no right to spend estate funds on medical care for a child who wasn't legally recognized. The argument, made in open court, proved too much even for Natchez's tolerance of moral contradiction. Judge Hargrove, clearly struggling with his own conscience, made a ruling that startled everyone. This child is ill. Her father acknowledged her as his daughter in his will. Whatever this court eventually decides about the distribution of Colonel Beauregard's estate, we will not allow a 10-year-old to die while lawyers argue about property rights. Miss Hargrove is authorized to use estate funds for the child's medical care. It was the first time the court had acknowledged Calpurnia's humanity over her status as property. It was a crack in the legal armor that Ada's side had been building. Calpurnia survived, but the illness left her weakened. And the public sympathy generated by a sick child, combined with the doctor's testimony about Silas's motivations, began to shift opinion in subtle ways. Not among Natchez's elite, who remained committed to defending the social order, but among middling merchants, tradesmen, small farmers who read about the case in newspapers. These weren't people with enslaved property to protect. They were people who could see the human tragedy beneath the legal technicalities. By spring of 1858, both sides were exhausted by the costs, financial and social, of the continuing battle. The estate's remaining assets were being consumed by legal fees. Ada had been forced to accept loans from her brother to maintain appearances. Eveline lived in a strange limbo, legally controlling vast properties while socially ostracized so completely that merchants refused to do business with her directly. And then Ezra Merrow made a move that brought the case to its crisis point. On March 12, 1858, Merrow filed a new motion that fundamentally reframed the entire case. Instead of simply defending Silas's will, he went on offense, demanding a full accounting of how the Beauregard estate had been managed during Silas's life, specifically demanding documentation of all property purchases, all sales, all transfers, with particular attention to acquisitions made after 1843. The motion seemed technical, but its implications were explosive. Marrow had found something in Silas's papers, and he was going to use it. The hearing on the motion took place on March 20th. The courtroom was even more crowded than usual, as word had spread that something significant was coming. Marrow took the floor with the controlled energy of a man holding a winning hand. Your Honor, the Beauregard family has argued throughout these proceedings that Miss Evelyn Hargrove is property, that she had no legitimate relationship with Colonel Beauregard, and that she has no legal standing to inherit his estate. I would like to introduce into evidence a document that was found among Colonel Beauregard's private papers. He held up a piece of paper, aged and carefully preserved. This is a manumission document executed in New Orleans, Louisiana on April 3, 1847, 10 years before Colonel Beauregard's death. It grants freedom to Evelyn, a woman of color, approximately 28 years of age, in consideration of faithful service and other valuable considerations. The document is properly notarized and filed with the Orleans Parish Courthouse in New Orleans. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Ada's face went white. Marrow continued, his voice gaining strength. This document was executed on the date of Calpurnia Beauregard's birth, Colonel Beauregard's second daughter by Miss Hargrove. Under the law, a child born to a free woman is born free regardless of the father's status. Calpurnia Beauregard was never enslaved. She has been legally free since birth. He let that sink in before delivering the next blow. Furthermore, I have here a second document executed in Natchez on June 15, 1844, 3 days after the birth of Josiah Beauregard. This document, also a manumission, grants freedom to Evelyn and her infant son Josiah, under similar terms. Ada's lead attorney, Delacroix, was on his feet. Objection. These documents were never presented before. These documents were hidden by Colonel Beauregard, Marrow said calmly, because he knew that acknowledging them publicly would expose his children to danger. A free woman of color in Mississippi exists in a precarious legal position. Her children, even if free by law, could be kidnapped and sold. It was safer for everyone to believe Evelyn and her children were still enslaved, even though they had not been for over a decade. Judge Hargrove leaned forward, his expression grave. You're saying that Miss Hargrove has been legally free since 1847, and her son since 1844. I'm saying more than that, Your Honor. I'm saying that for 13 years, Colonel Silas Beauregard maintained the fiction that Evelyn was his property while secretly having freed her. He did this not out of cruelty, but out of protection. He understood that a free woman of color with children who looked white would be at risk. But the legal reality is clear. Evelyn Hargrove has not been property for over a decade. She has been a free woman living in the Beauregard household. The implications cascaded through the courtroom like dominoes falling. If Evelyn had been free, then her relationship with Silas wasn't master-slave, but something else entirely. If her children had been born free, they weren't property, but heirs. If Silas had been secretly protecting them under the cover of enslavement while actually having freed them years earlier, then his final will wasn't an act of last-minute conscience, but the culmination of a decade-long plan. Ada found her voice, and it was ragged with fury and pain. He freed her. He freed her on the day our daughter was born, while I was in childbed, risking my life to give him another child. He was at the courthouse freeing his mistress. The raw anguish in her voice silenced even those sympathetic to her cause. Here was the real wound laid bare, not just that Silas had been unfaithful, but that he'd been planning for Evelyn's future while Ada gave birth to their children, that he'd used legal mechanisms to protect one family while allowing the other to believe itself secure. Marrow pressed his advantage. Your Honor, given these revelations, I move that this court recognize Miss Hargrove's legal status as a free woman, and recognize that Colonel Beauregard's will was not a manumission, but simply a testamentary transfer of property from one free person to another, which he had every legal right to make. The dower rights still apply. Delacroix argued desperately. Mrs. Beauregard still has legal protections which the will respects. Marrow countered. Mrs. Beauregard receives her 1/3 dower right as required by law. The remainder of the estate goes to Miss Hargrove, just as it would if Colonel Beauregard had left his property to any other free person. Judge Hargrove called for a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, everyone stunned by the revelations. Ada left, supported by her children, her face a mask of devastation. Evelyn remained seated for a long time, Josiah beside her, both of them trying to process what had just been revealed. Mother, Josiah said quietly, "Did you know about the manumission papers?" Evelyn shook her head. "He told me they existed. He told me to trust him, but I never saw them. I think..." Her voice broke. "I think he knew that if I believed I was free, I would act differently, and that might put us all in danger. It was safer for me to believe I was still enslaved. To act as enslaved, to never challenge the fiction. He protected us by making us complicit in our own bondage." The psychological complexity of what Silas had done was almost unbearable. He'd freed the woman he loved, but forced her to continue living as property. He'd ensured his children were born free, but raised them in slavery. He'd constructed an elaborate legal shelter while maintaining a social performance of ownership. Every act of love was also an act of cruelty. Every protection was also a cage. The court reconvened 2 weeks later for Judge Hargrove's ruling. He clearly struggled with the decision. His written opinion ran to 40 pages, full of legal reasoning that tried to balance law, precedent, and the moral quagmire the case had exposed. His core finding was narrow but devastating to Ada's case. The manumission documents were valid. Eveline had been free since 1847, her children since their births. Therefore, Silas's will was simply the transfer of property from one free person to another, which Mississippi law allowed subject to the limitations of dower rights. Ada received her 1/3 dower right to the real property for her lifetime. But Eveline received control of 2/3 of the real estate, the entirety of the personal property, the business interests, and the cash assets. More importantly, she received the legal recognition of her status. She was not property. She had not been property for over a decade. She was a free woman of color with the same rights to inherit and own property that any free person possessed under Mississippi law. The decision was immediately appealed to the Mississippi Court of Appeals, but the appeals court declined to hear the case. Letting Hargrove's ruling stand, the legal battle was over. After 18 months, countless thousands of dollars in legal fees, and the exposure of secrets Natchez would have preferred to keep buried, Eveline Hargrove had won. But victory, when it came, was hollow in ways no one had quite anticipated. Eveline took possession of the Cypress Street house. Ada, exercising her dower right, chose to remain in residence. The law gave her that option, and she took bitter satisfaction in forcing Eveline to accept her presence. For 2 years, the two women lived in the same house, barely speaking, each occupying different floors, each the victim and villain of the other's story. The arrangement proved psychologically unsustainable for everyone involved. Ada's children refused to visit while Eveline lived there. Natchez society shunned any social function that might include both women. The household staff existed in constant tension, uncertain whom to obey when orders conflicted. In 1860, Ada finally surrendered. She moved to her brother's plantation in the interior, taking with her the only thing she truly wanted from her marriage, the legal status of Silas Beauregard's widow. She would live another 32 years, dying in 1892, and she never spoke her husband's name again in public. Eliza never married. She lived with her mother until Ada's death, then moved to Columbia to live with cousins. She taught piano lessons to maintain herself and died in 1901, impoverished, but respectable. Silas Jr. attempted to establish himself in the cotton business, but his father's reputation followed him. Few planters would do business with the son of the man who'd betrayed his white family for his enslaved mistress. He moved to Texas in 1865 after the war and disappeared from the historical record. Some family letters suggest he died in the 1880s, but no grave has been located. Young Maggie married in 1862, just before the war made such things impossible. Her husband was a junior officer who died at Gettysburg. She never remarried and worked as a governess until her death in 1909. The Civil War destroyed what remained of the Beauregard estate. Whispering Oaks was occupied by Union troops. The fields burned. The main house ransacked. The Natchez townhouse was damaged by shelling. The business interests collapsed with the Confederacy. By 1865, the vast fortune that had caused such bitter fighting was gone, dissolved in the violence that tore the South apart. But Eveline and her children survived. They left Natchez in 1860 before the war, sensing the coming catastrophe. Using what remained of the estate's liquid assets, Eveline purchased property in Philadelphia in a neighborhood where free people of color had established a community. She invested in a boarding house, in a small shop, in modest ventures that would provide steady income. Josiah received an education. He learned a trade, carpentry, and established himself as a skilled craftsman. He married in 1868, had children, lived to see the 20th century. He died in 1921, having spent 57 years as a free man, and his grandchildren inherited the property he'd accumulated. Calpurnia recovered from her childhood illness and grew into a young woman of remarkable resilience. She became a teacher, educating freed children during Reconstruction. She married a minister in 1870. Her descendants scattered across Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, becoming teachers, doctors, lawyers, building lives that would have been impossible in the world where she was born. Eveline lived until 1889. She never remarried. She kept the gold locket Silas had given her until the day she died. Inside were two small photographs, one of Josiah as a baby, one of Calpurnia as a toddler. She was buried in Laurel Grove Cemetery in Philadelphia, in a plot she'd purchased herself, under a headstone that read simply, Eveline Hargrove Beauregard, 1819-1889. Free. The case of Beauregard versus Beauregard estate never appeared in the standard legal textbooks. It was cited occasionally in property law discussions, but usually in footnotes. The details were too uncomfortable, the implications too troubling. Natchez society preferred to forget the whole ugly affair, to bury it under the more dramatic tragedy of the Civil War. But the case documents survived. Hundreds of pages of testimony, motions, evidence, recorded and filed in the Natchez County Courthouse. They survived the war, survived fires and floods, survived attempts to purge embarrassing records. And in those pages, preserved in legal language and witness testimony, is the story of how one man tried to correct an injustice he'd spent a lifetime perpetuating, and how his attempt at redemption destroyed two families in the service of saving one. The questions the case raised never received satisfactory answers. Was Silas Beauregard a hero for trying to free his children? Or a villain for having enslaved them in the first place? Was Eveline a victim of systematic oppression? Or someone who benefited from proximity to power? Was Ada justified in her fury? Or was she defending an indefensible system? Could any of them have chosen differently within the constraints of their world? The truth, as the historical record suggests, is that everyone involved was trapped in a system that corrupted every human relationship it touched. Silas's attempt to be honest within a society built on lies exposed how completely those lies had infected everything: family, law, property, love, parenthood. His will didn't fix what was broken. It simply revealed how broken it all was. In the end, perhaps the most significant legacy of the Beauregard case was what it demonstrated about the unsustainability of the entire Southern social order. A system that required men to own their own children couldn't last. A society built on the fiction that some humans weren't fully human couldn't survive. The Civil War would arrive 3 years after Judge Hargrove's ruling, and it would burn away the legal structures that made cases like Beauregard's possible. But it would take another century before the descendants of people like Eveline and Josiah could fully claim the rights that Silas Beauregard died trying to give them. And even now, the echoes of those systems, the assumptions about power, property, and who deserves what, remain embedded in the landscape he left behind. The Beauregard Plantation House still stands, partially restored, operated as a museum now. Tour guides tell visitors about the architecture, the furnishings, the important people who once visited. Sometimes they mention the controversial will, though usually in passing. They rarely discuss what the case revealed about the foundations on which Natchez's grandeur was built. But in the courthouse archives, the case file remains, waiting for anyone curious enough to pull it from the shelves and read the testimony of a world that tried very hard to keep its secrets. What do you think of this story? Did Silas Beauregard find redemption in his final act? Or did he merely compound his crimes with one more act of cruelty, forcing 3 families to pay the price for his lifetime of cowardice? Leave your comment below. If you found this historical mystery compelling, subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy for more true stories from America's darkest chapters. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex, often disturbing truths hidden in our history. The past is never as simple as we want it to be, and sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened. And so, in that fading candle smoke of memory, amen. Forgotten Liturgy, whispering the haunted confessions of America's darkest historical sins, where forbidden truths rise from shadowed graves like mist over forgotten plantations.